On the 24th of February 2022, Russia began what it called a special military operation, a phrase that was meant to sound temporary, limited, and probably over by the weekend. Now, 4 years later, we can probably stop pretending that it is anything other than the largest armed conflict in Europe since World War II. And as a result, Russia was hit by one of the largest sanction regimes in modern history. Western companies left, access to key technologies was cut off, and financial links to the West were severed. So the expectation was simple: the economy should break, or at least that is what many had hoped. But then something strange happened. It did not collapse the way many people expected. In fact, Russia's official GDP started growing again. And that creates a problem, because if a country is sanctioned, isolated, and fighting an expensive war, how can its economy still grow? Is the data fake? Are sanctions useless? Is Russia secretly doing fine? The answer is more interesting than all of those, because this story is not just about Russia. It's a story about GDP itself. GDP is one of the most important statistics in the world. Governments are judged by it, markets react to it, headlines are built around it. But most of the time, we use it as if it tells us whether an economy is actually doing well. And this is where things get dangerous. Because GDP can rise for reasons that do not feel like progress at all. It can rise because a city is rebuilding what was destroyed. It can rise because households are spending more just to afford the same basic goods. And yes, it can rise when a country goes to war. So when someone says Russia's economy is growing, the real question is not just how much, the real question is growing because of what? And to answer that, we need to understand what GDP actually counts. Let's take a look under the hood of GDP. It sounds like a simple number, but underneath is a very specific way of counting economic activity. And once you understand what gets counted and how, Russia's growth numbers become much less mysterious. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. At its core, it measures the value of final goods and services produced inside a country over a specific period of time. This sounds technical, but the key word to remember is production. As an example, if a bakery sells bread, that counts. If a car factory produces a car, that counts. If a software company sells its service, that also counts. GDP is basically trying to measure what an economy produces. But GDP does not count every step in the production chain. It counts final goods and services. If steel is sold to a car factory and the car factory uses it to build a car, GDP does not count the steel separately and then the full car again. That would double count the same production. Instead, GDP just counts the final product, which in this case is a car. And GDP is also about when production happens. If a car is built in 2024 but only sold in 2025, that production still belongs to 2024. Economists count the unsold car as an inventory investment. But here's an important part: GDP should not be confused with welfare. It does not directly tell us whether people are happy, if they are free, or if their life is getting better. It just tells us that measured production has increased. And measured production isn't always the same thing as progress. The most common way to break down GDP is this formula: GDP or Y equals private consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. C is consumption. That means private households buying final goods and services. So if you buy an iPhone, if you pay for a haircut, or if you get your weekly groceries, this is all counted as consumption. I is investment, but not investment in the stock market sense. In GDP accounting, investment means building productive capacity, as in new factories, new machines, equipment, and also inventories. That is why a car produced this year but sold next year still counts as a inventory investment. G is government spending, the state buying goods and services. If the government builds a road, pays public employees, or buys military equipment, that spending enters GDP. And then finally, NX is net exports. Exports minus imports. Exports add to domestic production. Imports are subtracted because they were produced somewhere else. And these are just accounting categories, not a morality test. And that matters because in our war economy, one of these buckets can become enormous. And that bucket is government spending. If the state pays soldiers, places military orders, expands factories, repairs vehicles, buys fuels, buys ammunition, transports equipment, this is all economic activity. And while this kind of government spending boosts GDP, it rarely influences the quality of life of its citizens. Let's use an example to demonstrate this point. Imagine a factory that used to produce pots and other cooking equipment. Now, imagine that same factory is converted to produce ammunition. They both contribute to GDP, but they have a very different effect on the population. One is produced to improve the everyday life. The other one is designed to be fired, destroyed, and replaced. And that is a very, very crucial distinction. GDP counts pure output, not purpose. It does not ask whether the output is morally good, socially useful, or beneficial for the country's long term future. It asks whether something was produced and what it was valued. Now there is one important clarification. There is nominal GDP and real GDP. If prices increase while the same amount of goods and services are produced, GDP would increase even though there aren't more cars being produced or bread sold. This is nominal GDP. To get a more accurate GDP measurement, economists use real GDP, which takes inflation into account. Look at American growth numbers. If you compare nominal to real GDP, nominal GDP growth would overstate the real growth of the US economy. And this brings us back to Russia. While inflation did play a role in its economic development over the past couple of years, the question is not just whether GDP rose, the real question is what kind of activity drove that growth and what costs were hidden underneath it. So we now know what GDP actually measures. And with this framework in hand, let's get back to the puzzle that is Russia's economic development. When the full-scale invasion began in February 2022, the initial shock was real. GDP fell, international firms pulled out, and if we take a look at the ruble graph here, it collapsed almost overnight. Everyone watching expected what came next to be a prolonged collapse, but that didn't happen. Here is Russia's annual real GDP growth, a strong 2021, then 2022, the year of the invasion, a contraction of 1.4%. That is a hit. But look at what follows. 2023, 4.1% growth. 2024, nearly 5%. The economy did not collapse. It recovered, and it recovered quite quickly. But a single number in isolation can be misleading. So let's put Russia next to Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. Let's look at this comparison. Just by eyeballing this chart, you can clearly tell that Russia, here depicted in green, does not look like the disaster many had expected. Quite on the contrary, it is outperforming France, Germany, and the United Kingdom when it comes to real GDP growth since the invasion of Ukraine. So Russia's GDP did not collapse, and that needs an explanation. And the explanation begins with a formula. If you recall, GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX. In Russia's case, one of them did something dramatic, G. It became the dominant driver of measured output. And in a war economy, G means something very specific. It is not schools or roads or healthcare reform. It is war. Here we see military expenditure as a share of GDP. Russia, Germany, France, and the UK again. In 2022, Russia was already spending over 4% of GDP on defense. By 2025, that figure had risen to 7.5%. Germany, France, and the UK are all spending between 2 and 2.4%. Russia is devoting roughly 3 times as large a share of its economy to defense as its Western counterparties, and that spending flows directly into the economy as measured output. GDP went up, but that number was not free. When the state floods an economy with demand and the economy does not have unlimited capacity to respond, something has to give. You get pressure, and that pressure shows up in data. Here we have monthly inflation since 2022. Germany, France, and the UK all spiked, driven by the energy crisis, and came back down. By 2024, all three were near their targets. Russia is a different story. The initial spike was dramatic, almost 18% in spring of 2022, driven by the ruble collapse and the sanction shock. It came back down through 2022 and into early 2023. And then it started climbing again, persistently, 7%, 8, 9, 10. By early 2025, Russia's inflation was still well above where any Western economy was sitting. Countries that had their own serious inflation episode and resolved it. The central bank of Russia responded the way any central bank does when inflation gets out of control. It raised interest rates aggressively. This is Russia's key rate alongside the ECB deposit facility rate since early 2022. In March of 2022, Russia raised its rate to 20%, an emergency move to stop the ruble from collapsing any further. It worked, and rates were cut throughout 2022. But then, as the war economy overheated, a second hiking cycle began. 13% in mid 2023, 16% by year's end, and then 21% by the end of 2024. The ECB's equivalent rate peaked at 4% and has since then been cut back to around 2%. Russia's central bank only started cutting in 2025, and even then, very slowly. For most of the period since 2023, Russia's borrowing costs have been 5 to 10 times higher than in the Eurozone. That is not a sign of a calm and healthy economy. That is a central bank fighting an inflation problem it cannot fully resolve. So what do these high rates actually mean? We will go deeper into this in another video, but for now, imagine it like this. The central bank rate is basically the price of money in the banking system. It is a benchmark rate at which banks can get or place money with the central bank. So if that benchmark rate is extremely high, banks have very little reason to lend cheaply to ordinary customers. They pass those higher rates directly on to households and firms. So these high central bank rates are not just some technical number on a chart. They mean the money becomes more expensive, investment becomes harder, and growth becomes much more dependent on the state, rather than normal private borrowing. So far, the picture is clear. High rates, inflation that won't come down, the war sector crowding out everything else. If you were betting on what happened to the ordinary Russian households, you'd probably bet things got worse. So let's check. These are three common indicators that tell us how households are actually doing. So we have household consumption, which is everything families spend, food, rent, transport, all of that. Then real wages, which is the average salary adjusted for inflation, because a raise that's smaller than inflation isn't really a raise. And last but not least, retail sales, which is what shops are physically selling. The most concrete of the three, because it's harder to dress up than a wage statistic. So, three indicators. Let's see what they say. And it's quite surprising, because if you look at 2023 and 2024, real wages grew by over 8% and then by over 9% in 2024. Household consumption and retail sales recovered strongly. On this chart, Russian households look like they are doing reasonably well. So, which is it now? To understand what is happening here, you have to ask one question. Whose wages are up? A Russian soldier on a standard military contract earns roughly 210,000 rubles a month in base pay, which is around 3 to 4 times the average civilian wage before regional bonuses are included, because they add another 1 to 3 million rubles as a one-time payment. Workers in the military industrial complex have also experienced this wage premium. So yes, average wages are up, but it's pulled up by the war sector. The labor market has tightened, not because the civilian economy is thriving, but because hundreds of thousands of working age men are either at the front or working in industries that exist to support it. This is the core of it. The economy was busy. Workers were employed. Wages on average were rising. Output was being measured. But busy is not the same as healthy. An economy can be extremely active and still be consuming itself. None of what you're about to see registers as a subtraction in the GDP number. The war sector expands, and GDP counts that output. What it doesn't count is a civilian production that didn't happen because the resources went elsewhere. Borrowing at 21% kills businesses that would otherwise exist. Those businesses don't appear as a loss, they simply never show up. The men who died don't appear in any national accounts. Human capital, permanently gone, recorded nowhere. And the men who left, engineers, doctors, developers, that loss doesn't hit GDP this year. It hits productivity 5 years from now, where the economy needs them and they aren't there. None of these register as a subtraction in GDP. Russia is the example. GDP is a lesson. Not that GDP is useless. It is an excellent measure of production. The problem is asking it a question it was never designed to answer. But there's one number Russia is hiding. GDP can rise while a country arms itself. GDP can rise while factories work overtime. GDP can rise while the state pumps money into a war. But this number tells you what the war is actually costing. Not in rubles, not in budget shares, not in interest rates, but in people. So Russia did not collapse. That is a part many people got wrong. But it didn't collapse is not the same as it's fine. What the data shows is something more uncomfortable. Russia found a way to keep the machine running, but it did so by changing what the machine is for. This is not a recovery, it is a conversion. Our civilian economy was partially converted into a war economy. Factories changed customers, workers changed sectors, the state grew, the private economy stepped back. The question is no longer whether Russia can produce output. Clearly, it can. The question is what happens when more and more of that output depends on the war continuing. And this is where people get confused because the economy adapted and adaptation looks like resilience. New supply chains, import substitution, state orders replacing private investment. The numbers stayed alive, but adaptation can keep the numbers alive while making the economy worse. Here's what it looks like in practice. When Western suppliers cut off Russia, factories had to find alternatives, sometimes from China, sometimes domestic, often slower, more expensive, or technically inferior. The part gets sourced, the machine keeps running, but the machine is no less capable than it was. When competition from foreign firms disappears, domestic producers face less pressure to improve, prices increase, quality stagnates. The consumer pays more for less. GDP does not notice. When the state replaces private investment with military orders, the incentive structure of the entire economy shifts. You do not build for a customer who wants quality at a competitive price. You build for a procurement officer who needs delivery by a deadline. And if Russian history is any guide, a procurement officer who also needs a new dacha. These are very different economies. And on top of that, we have the people who left. Around 800,000 have left Russia since 2022. Average age 32. 86% of them with a university degree. Not people on the margins, the engineers, developers, and doctors. That loss does not show up in this year's GDP. It shows up later. That is why the sanctions debate is so poorly framed. People expect a collapse. When collapse didn't happen, many concluded that the sanctions failed. But that is too simple. Sanctions can fail to destroy an economy quickly and still make it poorer, less advanced, and less flexible over time. The right question was never, did GDP fall this year? The right question is, what kind of economy is being built and what can it do when the war is over. The bill has already arrived. Over 200,000 Russian soldiers have been confirmed killed, based on obituaries and court records. The real number is almost certainly higher. Western intelligence estimates put total casualties, so killed and wounded combined, at close to 1 million. Those are working age men, removed from the labor force, from families, and from the economy. Russia was already facing a demographic problem before it invaded Ukraine, and that war made this problem dramatically worse. The men dying at the front are the same generation that would have been starting families. The men who emigrated are the same generation that would have been building companies. Neither loss appears in any GDP calculation. GDP simply does not have a line for that. And that is the point. Not that GDP is wrong, not that GDP is useless, but that it was never built to count what a war costs a society. It counts what was produced, it does not count what was lost. Russia produced more, the war costs more. GDP recorded one of those, and some of the bill has not arrived yet.